Any employer in the country, small or large, charitable or non-profit, will be eligible for the scheme.
So we've all seen the televised government broadcasts on what the government plans to do during the outbreak. These particular plans heavily involve how they're going to implement certain measures to help and aid businesses and employees. Now, whilst much of the government plans that have been broadcast and communicated have met quite a positive response by the general public, and that being by both employers and employees, there are some big question marks with them. But in this video, I want to expose the truth of what these plans are actually about, who they'll really benefit, and what that means for you and me. So this is Revorec Recruitment Solutions. My name is Seb, and we do regular videos on the subjects of business and management, leadership and recruitment. So to basically look into this and expose the truth of what's really going on, we need to look at the three key areas that the government have put across that's going to impact employees and employers alike. Those three key areas start with statutory sick pay, the coronavirus job retention scheme, and the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme. So starting off with statutory sick pay, or SSP as it is often abbreviated to. Now the way statutory sick pay will work under this scheme is that the government will cover up to 2 weeks of an employer taking statutory sick pay, and they will cover that from day one, even if they haven't got a doctor's note or they've been signed off or anything like that. If they suspect they have symptoms or somebody else has symptoms in their household, then they are entitled to 2 weeks off that the government will repay the employer for. That means the employer still needs to pay them, but they can claim that back from the government as part of the statutory sick pay plan. Now, a lot of people don't know is that statutory sick pay can actually be claimed for up to 28 weeks, and the employer would therefore need to cover that. Now, the cost of statutory sick pay to a business is actually fairly minor. It's only £94.25 per week, or if you took it into account of a 40-hour contract per week, that's about £2.35 per hour. So from a business, that doesn't actually cost that much. Consider the average salary in the UK is actually £29,400, and this would only actually cover £4,901, then you can see that it takes quite a lot less to be able to pay someone statutory sick than you would on a full pay packet. But there are a few problems with this. Not to mention that trying to live on £2.35 an hour over an equivalent 40-hour contract isn't exactly very beneficial. It does mean that you'd only be taking 16% of your actual salary. On to the second point of the coronavirus job retention scheme, which basically covers furloughed workers. The idea of a furloughed worker is that instead of a company laying off someone or making staff redundant in order to take their costs off of the books, they can then have them classed as a furloughed worker. A furloughed worker is an employee who, instead of being laid off, is still actually on the books of the employer during the period that they are furloughed, but is not being paid for that period. Therefore, when the employer has a pickup in work, they can simply retake the person on, put them back on the payroll without having to have cancelled and rehired them. Now, under the coronavirus job interruption scheme, the government will actually pay up to 80% of a worker's pay, and the employer has the option of either paying the other 20% or simply saving that money and holding it back. On paper, this sounds like a really good scheme, but there are a few problems with this. Firstly, the employer themselves, to lay the person off, then is in a position where that person cannot work during the period. They can't do any work for the company, they can't have any productivities, any involvement with the business. They're basically sat at home, completely laid off, not doing any work at all. Therefore, what is the point of the company themselves paying 20% of their wages? And most companies will simply not choose to pay their wages at all. The second problem is that this only covers for 3 months. Now, although we're at the time of filming on a 3-week lockdown, just at the early stages of it, there is every reason to believe that either this period of lockdown or whatever the government want to word it as could be extended for longer. You do have to bear in mind that businesses will still have issues, certainly in particular industries such as hospitality, for a lot longer than this 3-week period. This means that the furlough scheme could go on for longer, and therefore up to 3 months these employers could be taking 80% of their normal pay. Now, if those workers previously to being furloughed were reliant or heavily reliant or even partly reliant on overtime, bonuses or commission, they'll be losing out money. Now this scheme itself, although it will pay up to 80% of salaries, that figure is only up to the equivalent of £2,500 a month. Now that £2,500, if you take that over 12 months for an annual salary, that's actually equivalent to £30,000. If the UK average salary is £29,400, this means that for anyone over the UK average salary, they're going to be potentially losing out on quite a lot of money. So this scheme itself will only really benefit low paid workers in the first place. And a lot of low paid workers are reliant on overtime, bonuses and even commissions. This means that although 80% of it is covered and it looks great on paper, the reality is probably going to be they're taking a lot more than a 20% hit on their pay. Now we've done a couple of videos on the coronavirus and how it will affect employees. If you want to see the latest one, click there. The final issue with the coronavirus job retention scheme is that when employers pay the staff, it's not where the government will immediately pay them back that money to reimburse them. What happens is the company themselves would need to pay the salary to the staff members and then use a system that isn't properly functional yet, HMRC, to claim that money back. Depending on how long that takes, if there are issues with the system, and if they have a very, very dwindling amount of cash flow in the first place, they could go out of business anyway. On to the government's business interruption loan scheme. Now, the way the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme works is that companies with a turnover up to £45 million annually can claim up to £5 million in loans to be able to cover their costs. With these business loans, 80% of it will be covered by the government in form of a guarantee. So any lender giving the money out only takes on 20% of the risk. There are a few problems with this particular scheme though. Firstly, the same loan providers that would normally be dishing out business loans will be doing these loans as well. That means that these same loan providers are going to be going through the same stringent process in order to assess a business's viability for the loan. However, remember that this particular loan scheme covers up to £5 million in a single loan. That means that, okay, the government might cover £4 million of it, but the loan provider will still have to cover £1 million of it. Any company that is going to be applying for this particular loan is basically going to the loan provider going, unless we get this loan, we are going to be going out of business. That puts them in a pretty high risk category. Those loan providers will then assess this and go, well, if we give them £5 million, okay, we can get back £4 million from the government, but if they're that high risk, there is a high chance we will lose the £1 million of our own money that we are not guaranteed for. Now, don't expect these loans to come in at a particularly cheap rate. Lenders aren't known, even at the best of times, of being fair when taking out high-risk loans, and believe me, these are high-risk loans. Now, although the government will actually pay the first 12 months interest rates, you're going to have to pay that afterwards. These loans are for up to 6 years, and most companies that have cash flow problems and need to be able to have a high volume of cash in order to survive the current lockdown or the economic slowdown or however long this goes on for, they're probably going to try and stretch those payments out for as long as they can, up to the maximum of 6 years. This means that those interest payments are going to be quite high. So when you do have to pay those interest payments back, you're going to have quite a high rate on your hands. Now, don't also be surprised if the lenders themselves don't say yes. Many of them will simply say no. Or if they do say yes, you're going to be on such a high rate that it's going to be untenable once the first year's government cover of the interest rates expires. So are there better solutions that the government could have come up with to help the economy in this time of crisis? In my opinion, yes. Firstly, with the coronavirus job retention scheme, instead of the government enabling employers to have to pay them themselves and then claim back the money, wouldn't it make more sense for the employer themselves to be able to go to the bank, pay the money, and the bank have an initial grant paid by the government that they could then immediately claim back as a same-day cash payment? They should also change the ruling on furloughed workers, where during this particular crisis that furloughed workers can work for companies and still be productive for them and paid the same money as they would be if they were furloughed and sat at home when they cannot be productive, and it is pointless for the employer and the economy as a whole. Remember, a furloughed worker cannot do any work or have any productivity in order to be paid under the coronavirus job retention scheme. If the coronavirus job retention scheme was changed, where workers were instead paid to work and therefore be productive for the employer if they could work from home, or they could do a different job that could be done from home, then that would add benefit to the employer. This would solve a lot of problems, limit the risk of cash flow shortages, and quicken up the process. Now, there's a better solution for the sick pay scheme as well. £94.25 a week isn't going to help anyone, especially when the UK's average salary is £29,400 over a year. Why not during a lockdown, as in the 3-week lockdown we're at the moment, where most people cannot do anything and are claiming sick pay, that they therefore pay 80% of the normal salary to those workers during this period. Finally, regarding business loans, is there a better solution for that? And I think there is. Instead of the government covering the first year's interest payments and then allowing companies to have to pay extortionate interest rates from those lenders over the longer term, why don't the government simply set a cap on the interest rates and charges that lenders can give to businesses during this particular crisis? And the truth is as well that the government want to try to help the economy, but you've also got to balance it out. They want you to do certain things. If they appear harsh at this particular point, most people aren't going to listen to them. So they have to come across as being fair, reasonable, and have the best interest of the country, the economy, and the health of the nation at heart. But the truth is, some of these schemes are in place realistically with the intention of being good, but the reality of being something else. And this is the actual truth behind it. First of all, the government know that companies will make redundancies more often than they will choose to furlough workers. This is because it's easier for most companies to simply let staff go, have them out of it, not have to worry about paying them 20%, and simply rehire people when all of this is over. If the company is already cash strapped enough to have to let them go in the first place, why would they simply furlough them, then have to wait around when they don't have any money in the bank to be able to claim the money back and take that risk? Why not simply let them go and rehire afterwards? And that is what most companies will probably choose to do. Now, at this point, the country is very much behind staying at home, staying indoors, doing all the right things and looking after the people that could be vulnerable, doing your part and a lot of community spirit. The problem is that many people can only afford to stay at home for so long. They will have to, at some point, go back to work or make the choice to go, well, do you know what, I can't afford my mortgage, I can't afford my bills, I'm going to go bankrupt. There's going to be a cut-off point. For the first few weeks, most people can survive it. They can use credit, they can use family savings, whatever, but that will only last so long. Now, bringing in the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme looks great to help businesses on paper, but the reality is that most lenders are simply going to either say no or charge such extortionate rates that companies cannot afford to pay them over the long term. Now, the companies that do go out of business are probably the ones that are going to get turned down for a loan. The well-run companies that are actually going to be able to survive this with that loan are therefore going to have to pay a shed load of interest payments over the longer term. And when the government hike back up interest rates when all this is over, they're going to pocket a pretty penny from it. The truth is, a small number of people are going to make a lot of money out of this outbreak. But for most of us, including you and me, we're probably not going to make much out of it. And that's the truth that the government don't want to tell you. So what are your thoughts on the schemes? Do you think they're a con? Do you think some of them are beneficial? Do you think some of them will need to be changed? How do you think things are going to develop over the coming weeks and months? Now, if you like this video, you know what to do. Follow us, subscribe to us, and click the bell icon so you won't miss any one of our forthcoming videos either.